And Diane, thank you. I think you'll let people in, won't you, as they, if they arrive a bit later. So thank you. So nice to see you all. I can see some faces that I recognise. Hi, Katie. Nice to see you. Um, the meeting is being recorded, and it will be mostly my slides and me talking. Thank you for joining today. I know we're at that point in the year where we're kind of dragging our toes behind us. So I really appreciate you taking this time to think about some of the things that we will cover in today's session. Um, just a little bit about me. I have been teaching primary and secondary for nearly 20 years. I wrote a book in 2018 called Teaching Primary Art and Design, and currently I still teach in a primary school part-time, but I also do a lot of freelance work with teacher training providers, with schools and academies, but also with cultural sector, so galleries and museums, to help them create content. So everything I speak to you about today is from my own experience with school and education, but also with cultural sector, and everything I speak about is in alignment with my own classroom practice. So I still very much am in the classroom and still very much enjoy being in the classroom teaching art. So I'm going to share my screen with you. If you have questions along the way, we are quite a small group, so feel free to unmute and shout at me. I don't mind that. If that's not your style, you can write the questions down, and hopefully at the end we'll have some time for Q&A. Otherwise, I'm available for you to email, but do jot down anything that comes up. Like I said at the start, it's very warm. I'm in London, South London. It's extremely warm in the flat I'm in. But hopefully today's session will be about you receiving. So I'm going to be sharing lots of really good resources with you, lots of ideas. There'll be some small moments of interaction from you, but nothing too taxing. Okay, so can you just give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen, just so I don't launch off into talking and you can't see anything. So of course you know that the theme and the title for today is Leading Cultural Capital and Equity in Art Education. So over the years, through a series of kind of circumstances, situations, global events, my own personal experiences, talking about issues to do with cultural capital, inclusivity, equity, representation in our art and design provision has become one of my real points of advocacy and something I'm really passionate about. So today I hope to help you, like I said, to feel really confident about making some small but practical changes in your art provision to enable you to feel really proud of the provision that you're offering in terms of those things. So we're going to talk a bit about the status quo of art in primary settings. Like I said, I continuously and continue to work with all sorts of different primary schools, not just in inner London, but through teacher training providers, even down to rural Wales, all sorts of different schools. But there are definitely commonalities and things that you see across the board. So we're going to talk about challenging those. We're going to talk about how to foster a genuine appreciation of diversity in your school. So especially since the killing of George Floyd, thinking about themes to do with diversity and anti-racism has become quite a kind of hot topic. Some of that, or in fact all of that, done with the best intentions, but some of that has been done in quite a reactionary way. So what I want to talk to you about is ways that we can really foster a genuine appreciation of diversity. So not just the display board that has different coloured handprints on it, or hello in different languages, but how we can genuinely celebrate diversity in our school communities. I'm going to talk to you about ways for children, students, artists to celebrate their own cultural backgrounds and why that is important in the current climate. And I'm going to hopefully offer you some really good resources and stimulation for you to take back in a very practical way to your classroom practice. Any questions so far? I'm not going to keep saying that. I'm going to assume that you'll shout out or write them down. Okay, so if we're going to talk about challenging the status quo, we need to first of all think about what I'm talking about in terms of the status quo. We're not just rebelling for the sake of rebelling. We need to understand what it is we're challenging and why we're challenging it. So in my experience as a primary art and design consultant, there are things that I have seen, like I said, across the board, whether that be a rural school in Wales or an inner city school in Zone 1 or Zone 2 in London. So my understanding and my experience leads me to realise that actually there is quite varied content in terms of primary school provision from school to school. You'll know that the national curriculum is really tiny. It's 2 documents and it's very, very non-specific. It's very broad. There are some good juicy things in there, which I talk about in other trainings, but essentially it leaves quite a lot open to interpretation. So therefore, that has led to content in schools being quite varied because it's very dependent on the art lead, on the enthusiasm and commitment to art and design from senior management and various other kind of themes. So I know that from primary schools, even just within the same borough in London, the provision in one school, the curriculum content in one school will be very, very different to a school that could just be 10 minutes down the road. I know that there's varied time spent on art, so to do with timetabling. Some schools do a kind of half a term on, half a term off for DT. Some schools, which would obviously be my preference, have at least an hour of art a week. Some schools go, whoops, we've done no art this term, quick, let's do an afternoon. So it's very varied again. I know that subject leads come from different backgrounds. So some of you may be from an arts background, some of you may have undertaken some sort of art degree. Some of you may have just expressed a mild interest in something creative, and that has led to you being tasked with leading art and design in your school. So again, big variation there. I also know from my communications with different schools and art leaders that assessment methods in art and design are often unclear. It's something I get a lot of correspondence about. How do I assess art and design? What methods do I use for assessing art and design? And likewise with progression. Another real point of kind of confusion and often bewilderment for art leaders. How do I map progression in my art and design provision? I know that there tends to be a focus on certain skills and techniques, drawing, painting, etc. And there tends to be a focus on certain types of art and artists. So I don't know if anybody wants to add anything in terms of status quos of art and design, but these are the kind of the main themes that I see running through from my work. Now, some of those, the solution or what I provide training on is thinking creatively about our approach to art provision, i.e. art doesn't have to and shouldn't fit into the protocols of other subject areas. So that is actually a whole set of other trainings that I offer. Okay, but I will just say to the things like assessment, to the things like progression, etc., that it requires us to be really bold as art leaders and think creatively about those things. And those are other trainings that I offer. However, today we're going to focus on challenging the status quo in the sense of having an anti-racist and inclusive approach to lessons and how we select art and artists that we use. Okay, so this is where we're going to put the focus for today in terms of how we challenge status quo. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds now. Got my status quo timer there. You have to amuse yourself sometimes, don't you? I'm going to give you 30 seconds to list 10 artists. Go. Okay, and you actually got a bit longer there because I had a bit of a faff with my timer on my phone. Okay, so there we go. So if you want to, feel free to hold up your list. Good, some interesting ones there. I'm just going to take a little screenshot. Frida, good, yeah. Okay, great. So that's a really interesting thing to do with if you do get to hold any staff trainings or anything like that, because what you find quite easily is that there tends to be the same kind of what I call the gang, who come up again and again and again. And that's not to blame anyone or call anyone out. That's just because this gang are part of what we call the Western art history canon. So these are the artists who have been considered the greats over many, many years. And even if you were to study art history at degree level, the same sorts of Western bias is there. And that has obviously trickled down to our secondary schools and so into our primary schools. So that as much as there are differences or disparities in primary art and design provision, generally, when you visit a primary school, you will see the same group of artists being used. Your Vincent van Gogh, your Andy Warhol, let's do Monet, let's do Kandinsky. These get repeated again and again. And of course, the problem with this is that they are majority dead white male. And so we end up with an art and design provision that has a strong bias towards this group of dead white male artists. And obviously this is problematic in terms of representation. So if you're a student, for example, and you're being fed through your art education from primary, probably all the way up to secondary, you're being fed ideals of art, so aesthetically, but also you're being spoken to about Van Gogh, Picasso, etc. You are going to very easily, without having to proactively search for it, you're going to very easily absorb the idea that to be an artist is to be a white man. So obviously this is important to break down, not just for inner city schools where you may have a demographic of students that is more diverse, but it's equally important in those schools that I keep mentioning, those hypothetical rural Welsh schools, just as important, even though the demographic of students may be different. So when we lean into this bias, we perpetuate ideals and stereotypes about what an artist is, who an artist is. One of the things that I really advocate for as well is that when you show artworks, you also, where possible, show photographs of the artist alongside. So if you think about doing that, if you were doing that for these pieces, yes, you've got a Georgia O'Keeffe in there and probably a Frida Kahlo in many schools, but if you were showing photographs alongside the artworks, again, the students are receiving that message that this is what an artist looks like. So it is problematic, and that's one of the status quos that we definitely need to challenge and look at. And again, like I say, this is not to shame anyone or blame anyone. I speak really openly and have spoken really openly at talks about the fact that even as a brown female growing up in London, when I started my career as a teacher, I would also lean into these great masters because that's what I'd been taught. And I also speak quite openly about my almost embarrassment that I never really questioned that I was kind of satisfied with, yes, these are the main artists. Oh, there's Frida Kahlo. She ticks the box for, kind of ethnic female artists. Whereas actually now in my teaching practice, I completely centre artists who are female. I teach in a girls' school, so I find that really important as well. I centre artists who are female. I centre artists who are not necessarily of the Western canon. And we may have a sprinkling of the Van Goghs and the Picassos. So completely flipped that. The other thing to say on that is that I recognise that actually as an art leader, if you are not fully confident or don't have the time and energy, and I know that's a real factor as well, then you will lean into pre-made resources, and they might come from various sources, but those resources that you lean into may also be really overusing this Western art history canon, which is why it's really important for us as art teacher training providers and consultants to provide you with stimulus and resources that you can use, because I do understand that there are time constraints and it's often easier to use the kind of pre-packaged approach. So, for example, we can quite simply begin to just go through our curriculum and think about how we can replace certain schemes of work, or in addition to the Van Gogh for self-portrait, we could also perhaps show someone like Amrita Shergill. So throughout the presentation today, I'll be introducing you to different artists. There are links in the chat, and you will receive a list of the links that I will use from the NSEAD as well. But feel free, if you want to jot down names of artists too. So Amrita Shergill, this is her. She is one of India's most celebrated artists, actually. And of course, probably all of you, maybe some of you, have not heard of her. She's of mixed heritage. So her mother was Hungarian and her father was a very high profile, quite wealthy Sikh man. And she followed, which was quite unusual for an Indian woman at that time, she was able to follow her passion as a portrait artist. So as well as the self-portrait that I showed you, which would be a wonderful example for looking at portraiture and also looking at paint techniques, proportions of the face, as well as this piece of work, she's also really, she has a collection of different portraits, and her portraits were often of everyday people. So they give an insight into the lives of everyday people. Someone's microphone is on, I think. So yeah, so that's Amrita Shergill. So there's no reason why for some of your kind of go-to schemes of work that you can't either replace the gang with some new artists, or at the very least show these other artists alongside. Okay, and like I said at the start, one of the things that I really advocate for is showing a photograph of the artist alongside their artwork. This really starts to build more of a picture of art as a bigger thing than just looking at artworks. There are artists out there, and you can even begin to look at the photographs of the artist. There are some fantastic photographs, for example, of Frida Kahlo, where she's painting, where she might be in her bed, sitting up with the easel in front of her. So you can actually start to have conversations about what it is to be an artist. So that's Amrita Shergill. I recommend having a look at her portraits. There is some lovely one. There's a really gorgeous one of three women in saris, all looking slightly off camera. Another example of where you could maybe add or replace is looking at abstract painting. So this is actually a bad picture. I've got a digital copy of a Kandinsky, just realised. Kandinsky tends to be one of those go-tos. And yeah, most primary schools love a bit of Kandinsky. They also love a little bit of Mondrian. But actually, and I've just seen in the last couple of weeks that there is an exhibition coming up at Tate of Hilma af Klint. Now, if you don't know Hilma af Klint, please look her up. Her work is gorgeous, and she is a very, very interesting lady. And it's becoming increasingly obvious that actually she, rather than Kandinsky, was one of the first and most at the forefront of the abstract painting movement. So the exhibition at Tate, from what I can see from the literature they've released so far, is going to place those two artists next to each other and talk about the fact that Hilma af Klint was actually, just as, she was definitely prolific. She produced a huge body of work, but her work is just as much in that abstract canon as Kandinsky's, and she actually was a bit of a pioneer. So her work, which is interesting, is she would say that she would actually channel things. So she was also in that scene of being quite esoteric, and she was quite open to channeling things and spirituality. So a lot of her work, she would say she would channel. So I've looked at Hilma af Klint several times with really young students. It's an excellent entry point for looking at shape, line, colour in art, which of course they're three of the formal elements of art, which are otherwise known as the ingredients in a piece of art. You've also got tone, texture, pattern. I may have missed something out there, but looking at Hilma af Klint's work is an excellent lens through which to look at these things. And of course, photograph of Hilma af Klint there alongside. And you can obviously talk about things like, you know, why is this a black and white picture? Well, obviously, this predates colour photography. So you start to build a wider context for looking at art. You're not just looking at a picture, you're looking at the story to do with the picture, you're looking at the lives of the artist, you're looking at the time that this art was produced. So you begin to contextualize things even in primary school, Any questions so far? Okay. So we love Hilma af Klint. She's brilliant. And we love Amrita Shergill. We also love Picasso. We do. But again, another example of how we can contextualize art and bring in themes of diversity is when looking at Picasso's Cubist work, or even any of the Cubist works indeed, we should and we could contextualize by talking about and thinking about how these artists were actually influenced by the Makonde people and their sculptures. So often you will see in the sculptures of the Makonde people that this idea of juxtaposition of geometrical shapes is present. And we know that for certain, Picasso, for example, was influenced by these sculptures as part of that movement. And this is a photograph demonstrating that, where you have Picasso surrounded by sculptures. Okay, so bear with me, my computer's doing something funny. It seems to me my laptop is also getting hot, and it feels like it's much slower. Okay, I just want to show you some of the links that I'm going to be sharing with you. So we talked about Amrita Shergill. I'm also going to share with you a link which talks about the upcoming exhibition with Hilma af Klint and Kandinsky. I love this title, The First Abstract Artist, and it's not Kandinsky. So that exhibition's coming up. There'll probably be a teacher session on that as well, which I recommend you keep an eye out. The Makonde, so I've put a link there to Google Arts and Culture, which is a website I use a lot. And there's a little story of the Makonde people there that's been animated. So that's in the links there for you too. So just get the slideshow back up. So yeah, contextualizing things as well as going in and replacing or adding a range of artists. We can also contextualize artworks that we look at so that we acknowledge the influence of other places and cultures, because often that's something that's been missed. We are, as a country, getting better at that. So where we have exhibitions, often the curation will acknowledge, but we've still got a long way to go. So I've definitely seen Picasso exhibitions and Cubist artworks that pay no mind to the fact that these ideas came from certain places in Africa. Similarly, Monet and a few other artists, including Van Gogh, were very, very influenced by the Japanese aesthetic. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the Hakusai Great Wave. Those works in Japan at the time were not actually considered fine artworks. They were printed in multiples, and so they were quite accessible to the general public. And so artists like Manet, Pissarro, Monet, and of course Manet and Monet were influenced by this Japanese aesthetic. And 100% Monet's Gévaudan garden was modelled on Japanese gardens. So he was so influenced by the aesthetic that he returned to France and he built a Japanese garden inspired by those aesthetics. And as we know, he then went on to produce multiple canvases of the water lilies there. So Monet would be working on several canvases at one time, and he would go out and he would be capturing the light changing. And as we know, the Impressionist artists, what distinguished the Impressionist artists from the artists that had come before them was that they were going outside and painting. They were painting in the outdoors. Does anybody know what the invention was that meant that artists could go outside and paint outside? Feel free to unmute and shout. I can see thinking faces. So it was actually the invention of tubed oil paints. So before that, artists would have to have an assistant probably, and they'd be mixing pigment in their studios, and it would be very time consuming, very laborious. And so they would be based in their studio. Paintings pre this kind of 1800s time have that kind of dark, heavy feel to them, because even though they might have been painting an outdoor scene, the light would have been studio light. So for the first time in the 1800s, that group of artists known as the Impressionists, of which Monet was one, were free to go outside with their easel or their tubed paint and capture light changing in the outdoors. So you can see what I'm doing here as I'm giving you these hopefully ideas for how to contextualize and giving you artists. I'm also talking to you a lot about the art. So really important that when we talk about art with the students, that we don't just show the art, that we contextualize, that we share the stories, because that is what makes things come alive. One of my favourite workshops at the NSEAD get together on Saturday, some of you were there I think, was a storytelling workshop where a lady sat in front of an artwork with all these amazing fabrics and artifacts, and she told a story of Psyche and Cupid, of which there was a painting behind her. And it came alive. The second she started storytelling, I was just like, I was in. So telling stories about the art, telling anecdotes about the art is really important, and especially important when those stories and anecdotes include us moving away from isolating things outside of their cultural influence from other places and cultures. Just going to do a time check. Okay. We will have a little comfort break at some point as well. So again, I think my computer might be slightly overheating, so hopefully it doesn't. I'm just going to stop share for a second and go back to this. Okay. I'm going to have to, for some reason, it's not letting me switch between tabs very easily. Just bear with me. So I've put this article in there about Claude Monet and the impact of Japanese art. Okay. So of course, as I said, I know that finding resources and sourcing artists takes time, and that you don't always have all that time, and so it can be easier to just lean into the resources that are readily available. There are many resources out there, so one of the things I've tried to do today is to offer you resources but not overwhelm you. So just to give you a few, so this is one that I started. It's a Padlet. I think most of us are a bit in love with Padlet by now. Most of us know Padlet. If you don't, definitely have a look at it. I use it a lot. So this is essentially a giant pin board that goes all the way down, 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 and all the way across, cross, cross. And what I've started to do on this pin board is populate it with global majority artists. And I've tried to also include a good link to that artist's work and a description of the artist's work. Other people can add to it. So it's a collaborative pin board. So I do invite you to add to this any artist you come across. And what I've tried to do is write a bit about the work, so that as a primary school teacher, if you're trying to link to a preset theme or topic, or you're trying to look for a painter or a sculptor, you'll be able to source that. Okay. So I do recommend, I've put this in the notes. So what I would like to invite you to do now, I'm going to copy it and paste it in there again, because what I'm going to give you just a few minutes to do now, I'll pop it most recent. Oh, that's not the one I wanted. I'll pop it in the notes now so that you can just have a little look. And what I invite you to do is have a quick browse of the Padlet. And if you don't manage this, don't worry. Think of a scheme of work or a scheme of work based on an artist that you use at the minute that you think, actually, I'd quite like to replace that. And just have a little look at the Padlet and see whether you actually might be able to just spot something that you could replace that with. So I'll pop that in there. Okay, so that's the most recent link in there. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes So just have a look at the Padlet, have a scheme of work or an artist in mind. So it might be that you do a Van Gogh painting scheme of work, but maybe have a look and see if you can see another painter, and they'll give you four minutes to do that, actually, because we haven't got that much time. And I'm going to stay here. Are you all managing to open that Padlet? So each of the notes in the Padlet is a link as well to open to more about the artist. So have a little look, and then I'll be here, so you can always nip back and chat to me in that time. So 4 minutes. And if you're stuck, if you're looking at it and you're like, I don't know, I've got no idea, just come back to me and have a chat with me. You can be like, oh, we've got a printing thing and I need to link it to someone. Or...
Emily, Lucy here.
Hi, Lucy.
One of the things that I work in a special school, and one of the things that we've been trying to introduce is disabled or artists with different disabilities, differences. Do you include that in your information, or is that something that I would put in as well?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely welcome any contributions you can make. Like I said, it's a collaborative resource, and I certainly don't have all the answers. I think that is something that we have endeavoured to include on there. I think various people have posted. So yeah, definitely open to you adding more.
Lovely.
Yeah, 100%. Brilliant. Three more minutes. No, 2 more minutes, sorry. If you haven't managed to find anything, don't worry. One more minute.
Emily.
Yeah.
Hi. I've never used Padlet before. Is there a way of searching it, or do you just look?
No.
Okay.
There isn't, because the content, each of the columns or bits that you see are a bit like a post-it note.
Okay, so they're just put down in like order.
Yeah. So they're roughly in chronological, but as I said, other people do contribute, so I don't always get to go in there and tidy it up. They're roughly chronologically ordered, but it is a kind of scroll through and look.
Okay. Very nice. I like the cork background.
Yeah, pinball. You can have all sorts of background. But I've worked with schools before where I've actually designed their whole curriculum map on a Padlet, because you can actually put videos in there, and you, like I said, you can scroll all along to the right and all the way down. So there's quite a lot of possibilities with it.
Thank you. It looks really interesting.
Okay, and we'll start to come back together. Does anybody want to just share maybe one of the swaps they've made, because that may be useful for somebody else? Of course, as we know, there are often crossovers with themes and topics in primary school. So does anybody care to sort of just chat about what they chose to replace or add to, and who they chose? Katie.
Hello. Oh, luckily for me, Emily, I found your Padlet a few months ago, which I've used absolutely loads, and I'm in teacher training, so I've flagged it up to all my students who've all been very grateful for it, because it's, you know, because you do feel like you're just trying to sort of put a pin in an enormous map, don't you, otherwise? So we looked at Frank Bowling instead of Jackson Pollock. So we kind of, obviously we did acknowledge Jackson Pollock, because, you know, like you say, we weren't trying to obliterate other people, but we kind of said, but, you know, actually, if you're looking for a slightly more multicultural, slightly more sort of a different outlook, then actually these two have got quite a lot in common with the sort of action painting and things like that. So that was one that we did.
Yeah, lovely. And again, Frank Bowling he's a favourite of mine. He's from Guyana, which is where my family are from as well. So he's definitely close to my heart. But I remember once showing, I'm just trying to find him on the list. I remember once showing his work alongside a photograph of him to a group of primary school children, and this group of girls just got the giggles, and I sort of said, "Oh, what's so funny?" And they said, one of them said, "Oh, he looks just like my granddad," and she found it hilarious. She couldn't stop laughing. So, you know, moments like that make you realise, actually, you know, we are showing the students artworks and people that mean something to them and that should resonate with them. Oh, there we go. There's a lovely Vanessa.
He's brilliant to watch, because he's like 98 or something now, isn't he? Yeah. And so he's basically like a grumpy old man, and just sort of tells his people what he wants them to do. Yeah. So it is amazing just watching. And he's obviously got a very set idea of how it's. So I think it was quite a nice artist, because I think a lot of students assume that that kind of abstract painting is sort of an easy sort of afterthought, but actually watching him work and seeing the care and attention that goes into every tiny colour and every tiny splash and dribble, I think was really inspiring for them.
Definitely. And his series, the map paintings, I always find quite good to look at with students, because you can kind of incorporate stencils into that, because he used a lot of stenciling in that. And also his map paintings talk a lot about, speak to the fact that he moved from different countries or lived and worked in different places. So yeah, he's definitely a really, really nice one to look at, and just such beautiful, vibrant colours as well, which is always nice. Thank you. Okay. Anyone else want to share any artists that they've looked at or has piqued their interest even?
Hello, I'll share. So good old Georgia O'Keeffe pops up in foundation and in year 3, and she matches actually the foundation much nicer. And so I liked Azuma Makoto. I've never seen his work before. That's incredible. So I think the year 3s could take his photographs and work their drawing unit around that a bit more. Brilliant. I think it was quite near the bottom there somewhere. Excuse me.
Oh, that's brilliant. What I love is just, this is just instant, quick ways that we are already starting to kind of like broaden out our provision. I obviously cannot find now, but yeah, I'm having trouble finding. But yeah, that's great. So yeah, I mean, Georgia O'Keeffe is brilliant, and of course you can always look at her, and you can always look at the same artist and build on that in terms of progression. But yeah, even if you mention her alongside, what I always recommend, and in lots of my other training, I talk about having a key artwork for each scheme of work. And so you'd have a key artwork, the key skills and techniques, the outcome. And obviously that doesn't mean that you can't also show and flag other pieces, but it just means that they're at the core of probably 36 artworks that children will look at from year 1 to year 6. And we have to make sure that those are representative and diverse. Anybody else before we move on want to share? it's almost addictive. Like I have new artist crushes, like almost every week, definitely every 2 weeks. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is my new favorite artist, and I must find a way to use this artist in the classroom. Once you get yourself into that habit, it's actually, I'm sure some of you are like this already, you actually feel like you're not just looking for something to teach about, you get so excited about it as well. And this artist, I'll just show you Delita Martin because I love her. Another really good, there's so many great portrait artists, but she does these huge portraits that she mixes with kind of woodblock printing and different patterns. And again, just a really good alternative for looking at portraits. So these are some of her portraits. This kind of thing with prints overlaid. That's Delita Martin. Okay, so hopefully that Padlet is going to be of use to you, and it's there for you to contribute to. Like I said, I really, really want people to contribute and add to it as well. Excuse me. One of the other things that I recommend is in your planning document to include thumbnails of the artists and the artworks. Obviously, if the artists are classical or pre-photography, then you won't be able to have a picture of them. But doing that just keeps you accountable, really, and also it's a really quick way of sharing with a visitor or the rest of the members of staff how your art curriculum has this great coverage and is actually, I think, it's quite a powerful planning document. And that kind of links into when I started, and I said we're not going to be challenging the status quo of assessment and progression, etc. today. However, things like adapting your planning to suit your subject is a way of pushing back against, well, actually my planning document can look different because I'm a visual subject. So I really recommend including these photographs of the artists in your planning document. And I know some schools that I've worked with now will even have a code, so they'll have like make sure that they've got like female, different people from different places and times and cultures, disabilities, all sorts of different, diversifications happening there. So what's an interesting starting point with that is actually to look at your current planning document, populate that with the, if you've got time to do this, populate that with the images of artists, or even just write white male, WM. That's how I started years and years ago. I went through my planning document and just wrote WM, white male, and I was like, oh my gosh, this whole thing is WM. And then I started to kind of swap things in. So yeah, really recommend. And if you do that, feel free to send me a screenshot of it. I just love seeing these. They just make me really happy. Okay, so we've talked briefly about how we can diversify the artists that we are teaching the students about. Obviously, we could go on and on about that. There are many more examples I can give you, but hopefully that's given you a little bit of a launch pad in terms of replacing or adding to current art and artists, in terms of contextualizing, so that when we're talking about movements or art styles that have been influenced by other times and places and people, we do that. And also using resources like that Padlet, but also there are many other gallery websites that have good lists of global majority art and artists that you can use as well. One of the other status quos or biases that I see in primary schools is this real tendency to hold certain art forms, materials and styles as the ideal of beauty and real art. And so that's often oil paintings, it's often bronze sculptures, and it's often those things above other art forms, such as making, such as textile art, etc. And often what you'll find is that if you only look at oil painting or bronze sculpture, that does sideline a lot of female artists, a lot of artists who are self-taught, a lot of artists who work more from traditional lineages. So what I invite you to do is also to look at the styles and materials used in the art that you are introducing the students to. For example, there will be some students possibly that you teach who actually have family members who are creative and artists in all but name, because they maybe sew, maybe they make things out of clay, maybe they make jewelry, maybe there's a tradition of some things like this in your students' generations behind them, in front of them. So important to think about that as well, how we prioritize certain art forms above others. Like I said, if we sideline lots of these art forms, we sideline a lot of women, because where women were not elevated for their crafts, their textile work, and what was elevated was the kind of oil painting done by certain male practitioners, then we actually just completely sideline a whole heap of really rich cultural resources. So the links I've given to you, again, you will no doubt find your own fantastic links for looking at different crafts and traditional art forms, but the Crafts Council website is actually a really nice place to start. They've got, one of the things I love is they've got stories where they you get to learn about different artists. So for example, 15 glass artists, so obviously Chihuli's in there, but you'll have a range. They're very good now at being quite diverse in the crafts people that they introduce. So Crafts Council website, but also, like I said, looking at individual artists who may not necessarily work in the mediums that we are used to seeing as fine art or proper art. So this artist, Michelle Reeder, is one of my favourites to look at with young children. She makes, I suppose you would call them junk models, but they don't look junky, they're fantastic, and she uses recycled materials. So she actually did a piece of work called 7 Wasted Men, which she made. I'll just show you it, Michelle. There we go. She made this using, I think it was 7 days of rubbish for each of these people. So 7 days of rubbish from a child, 7 days of rubbish from an adult male, etc. So again, branching out so that we don't just look at those artists who appear in the National Gallery or Tate, but we also source interesting artists who are working in different mediums. So Michelle Reeder, I think she actually does workshops. And if you've seen my book, I used her as one of the artists in there because I just think her work is a really good example as well of showing students how art can hold a message. So you can start looking at activist art that's about influencing, change for the better, all important themes. Okay, so the other thing that I want to speak to you about is when we make curriculum link. So one of the things I see very often in primary schools is that there is a requirement. Sometimes it's a kind of assumed requirement, and actually when the Art League challenges it, senior management are open to it changing. But there seems to be a kind of tendency towards linking art schemes of work to preset topic with a capital T or history projects. And this can lead to really tenuous links. It can lead to, like, we're doing the Vikings or we're doing India. And this is something that we have to be really, really mindful of now, because what can end up happening is that we pull in motifs or artifacts or food groups such as lentils that are not necessarily representative of the countries or places that we are trying to teach about. So we start to conflate a whole culture, whole group of people, whatever, to one motif, one food group, one thing, like a mask. For example, doing African masks is not a thing because in Africa there are many countries, and each of those countries may have different tribes or different uses for various motifs and patterns on their masks. So we have to make sure that where we make links to other places and people, we contextualize again. And again, this is not to shame anyone or call anyone out, but it's just now we're just bringing this self-reflective quality to our work. We're bringing in the self-awareness, which is great. So, for example, I remember being on a forum and somebody had typed in a question: has anybody got any suggestions for India, for art, for an art topic for India? I've already got the henna patterns ready. And I just thought, oh gosh, this is just, you know, it's fine to teach about henna patterns, but what we need to do is not just go, we're doing India, let's all paint our hands with henna patterns, or let's all cut out the thing of a hand and draw a henna pattern on it. Because what we must start to do is to contextualize things. So, for example, if you are wanting to look at henna patterns, we would need to look at the art of henna and the fact that it's been practiced in Pakistan, India, Africa, Middle East for many, many years. We might even start to look at the actual design. So specifically look at the designs that we see. And one of those designs that we often see on henna is the paisley pattern. And again, contextualize. We can then talk about how that pattern originated in Kashmir in the 11th century, and it became associated with Kashmiri shawls. And these shawls were often given as gifts from wealthy people from Kashmir to wealthy people in Europe. And so that design, the paisley pattern, became more and more popular. And eventually, the legend says that one of the Kashmiri princes gave a shawl with the paisley pattern to Josephine, who was of course Napoleon's wife. And eventually the paisley pattern became so popular in Europe that the Scottish town of Paisley became a producer of these shawls with the paisley pattern. And so what was known as, I don't know the name of it before, became known as the paisley pattern. And of course, the henna pattern is used for celebrations. It was historically actually used because the qualities of the henna plant have a cooling and antiseptic quality. So henna was often used as a way of cooling the body in especially places that were in the desert. So it was actually started with a practical use and then became to have this aesthetic quality to it. So if we're going to teach about things, we have to make sure that we think about the geographical links, the historical links, and actually that's when, instead of art serving geography or serving topic with a capital T or serving history, we begin to see that art is a fantastic lens through which to learn about different times, places, and people. And for me personally, I was quite disengaged with history at a secondary school level, very disengaged. I don't believe that I had teachers that were particularly engaging. And it was only until I started to engage with art and art history that history came alive for me, because I was seeing it through the lens of these things and artifacts and artworks. So in this way, it's a shift from going, oh, the topic is the Victorians, we've got to do some art to do with the Victorians. Yeah. We start to really, really build a rich curriculum. And I really advocate that if you can't find a good art link to your topic, then actually use that as a chance to have a discrete art scheme of work. And again, that's a whole nother set of training around planning and designing curriculum. But there are different approaches to planning a scheme of work which don't include linking it in a kind of arbitrary way to pre-existing things. Okay, so another example of how we might link to pre-existing themes, one that comes up a lot is the Vikings. Most schools do the Vikings. So, and what I see a lot of is, oh, we're going to make a Viking shield out of cardboard, which the children, to be fair, do enjoy. I know they do, especially if you then take them out to the playground and have a Viking battle with them. But you know, things like making a cardboard shield, unless you're doing it in a very specific way and you're teaching joining skills and you're teaching how to create different forms out of the cardboard, you're doing a design element to it before, you're looking at specific examples of Viking shields, for example, from the Sutton Hoo burial mound, it's possible to do Viking shields badly in a way that doesn't serve art, in a way that's just doing art to fit in with the Viking. So I really suggest thinking quite laterally sometimes about the links that we make to our topic as well. So for example, if you're looking at the Vikings, why not look at the Tales of Asgard, which is a comic book series, or the Marvel comics also have some editions which are about gods and goddesses. So what the students can then do is they can learn, and you'll know if you've ever tried to do a poster with students, they don't know how to do posters because they've not been taught about how to have font size here, probably 3 different font sizes, how to have the image centrally, how to have an eye-catching image that's not too complicated but it conveys the story. So you're teaching them art and design skills rather than just getting them to make something that's to do with the theme they're covering. So here you can see examples of students' work where they've used their prior knowledge of gods and goddesses and have created comic book covers which make use of their font design and make use of composition and make use of their knowledge to do with the gods and goddesses and convey that in a quite a contemporary way that is about the art and design. Okay, another example here is if a class topic was with the Windrush and the students are learning about the Windrush, rather than going, well, we're going to look at this Windrush artist and we're going to reproduce work by this Windrush artist, take the theme Windrush and invite the students to make art inspired by their learning about the Windrush. So in this experience, this was a year 3 cohort, and they were given choices in terms of you could have A3 paper or A4. They could choose either felt tips or colouring pencils, and they were given an A3 visual prompt sheet which had on it some of the images that they saw in their topic and history lesson as stimulus. And then they were simply told, now you use your imagination, use your prior learning and make a piece of art about the Windrush. And what you can see here is that actually when you sit with these students and you talk to them about their work, through their artwork, they are then able to give you insight into their knowledge about the Windrush. So this one, which you can't see properly, but in the windows, you have different characters and each of the characters has a different expression on. And this child was able to say, well, this person is feeling apprehension because they're leaving their home, they're leaving their family. This person excited because they think they're going to have better job opportunities. So through their artwork, if you give students the opportunity, they can use their art as a way to express their learning in a topic or history subject without you having to go, let's make, Chinese lanterns. So it's just a slight shift in how we think about linking to topic that's not reductive. Another example, the Tudors. So if we're doing the Tudors, yes, you might look at the Ditchley portrait here, but how about making sure that we have integrity in terms of the art and design learning element? So children use this as a lens through which to learn grid drawing. I hate grid drawing, I find it really boring, but year 4, this is a side point, year 4 loves stuff like this because in terms of drawing development, by the time students hit age year 3 and year 4, that's when they start to become really aware that their drawing doesn't look how they want it to look in their head. So year 3 and year 4 are good times to plan in things like grid drawing, to do things like perspective drawing, because it just gives those students a little bit of empowerment and a little bit of structure, which helps them feel good about their drawings. That's just a side point. Again, we've got the Fire of London. Instead of just doing the dreaded tissue paper in orange, red and yellow, this is students looking at a pre-existing etching by an artist about the Fire of London. They're experimenting with, this is year 2, experimenting with different types of mark making in line, and then they're using that knowledge to continue on this picture. So we're always trying to hold the integrity of art and design as a subject matter. And even though I said if it doesn't link to the topic, do a discrete art curriculum, there are often ways to link it. You just have to sometimes think laterally, and rather than taking just the skill and the technique, you might also take the concept of a piece of art and use that. So another example is looking at motifs. So to use the Vikings as an example, you could look at Viking artifacts. The students pick out motifs or repeat patterns, create their own pattern, and then design a piece of contemporary jewellery and make it out of clay. So we're thinking about how we can be more kind of contemporary, more relevant for the students. So I want to show you these two links as a resource. So look at that. Oh, so I put some links to the Paisley pattern in there just in case. I want to also, oh, I'm not sharing, am I? Hang on. Very like 2021 mistake there, wasn't it? Not sharing the screen. Okay, can you see the Masks of the World site? So this is a really good site to look at if you do want to look at masks, and I've given you that link. It's got categories, so you can look at masks from all over the world, and even if you do go to African masks, it gives you really specific kind of information about the different styles and uses, etc. It's a fascinating website. Get lost on there. And like I said, I've given you some links to history of Paisley pattern. And the site I wanted to show you is this one. So this is Art UK. Some of you probably already know it, but one of the great things about sites like this is that you can search, you can discover artwork, and you can search by themes as well. So if you've got a theme at school that you're trying to fit into, you can actually go and type it in here. So if I type in, I don't know, water, you'll get a selection of art linked to that theme. So it's really, really useful, especially if you're feeling a bit like, oh, I don't know where to start. And then obviously within that, you'd apply your filters to do with inclusivity, diversity, etc. And the other site that I wanted to show you is this one, Google Arts and Culture. This is a great website. They're always adding new content. So it's really, as it says, all about art and culture. There are all sorts of different links here. So one of the fantastic features on this is the zoom tools. You can zoom in so close to pieces of work that you can actually see the brush marks on them. But also you can do that thing of exploring by theme. And just if you're a bit stuck for inspiration, it's just a really good website for just kind of browsing and looking for different relevant artworks. Themes, it's got themes like this, pride, memories, all those sorts of things. So that's Google Arts and Culture. And I'm just going to do a time check. I just want to quickly show you how good the Zoom tool is, because it's insane. I'm going to go to the Starry Night for this. I'm going to go to Bangkok. So imagine on your whiteboard, you're trying to teach about use of brush marks. You can zoom in so far to this, and the quality is still there. You can actually see how the colours have been mixed. You can see the canvas. And there are really fun ways of using this. For example, if you're showing a painting, there's a painting called Beach at Trouville, which is by Monet, and it's, like I was saying about the Impressionists going outside for the first time, one of the great things about Beach at Trouville is when you zoom into it, you can actually see a clue which tells you that this was painted on the beach rather than in a studio. And the clue is down here. It's the sand stuck on the canvas, which tells us that as Monet was painting his wife-to-be with her chaperone, the sand was blowing up onto the canvas. So Google Arts and Culture, fantastic website for looking at, for getting inspiration. Okay, so just check the time. We're going to have a little comfort break in about 10 minutes. Any questions so far on things we've just spoken about? Okay, I'm going to move on. So the next thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is this thing of us all looking at black art. So whether that be on during Black History Month, which I'm not a huge fan of. I get that it has a value in some way, but or whether it be now that we're just kind of looking at our curriculum and we want to include art by Black artists. So yes, we do want to do some of the things that we've already spoken about in terms of diversifying, but just to kind of invite you to think about things from a slightly different perspective as well. So I'm going to just show you some examples of artworks that, rather than just swapping in, like we said, kind of like obliterating all the white male artists and swapping things in. One thing I really advocate for is actually giving the students more credit than that, especially in Key Stage 2, but also to some degree in Key Stage 1, and looking at pieces of work that support critical thinking and dialogue and discussion. So we know that, for example, in the Tate collection, and they are doing lots of work towards improving this, but in the Tate collection, there are many pieces of many problematic paintings, down to, in their restaurant, one of their kind of more kind of large-da restaurants, the mural on the wall there being incredibly problematic in terms of what it depicts. But they are trying to do better and to acknowledge. So they have some fantastic pages on their website, such as this one. In their collection, they have this piece of work. So, for example, obviously, you may not wish to show the whole painting to a group of students, but even just for us to think about, rather than just looking at Black artists, it's sometimes useful to also think about a different approach, which is to engage with critical discussion about art that depicts Black people. So this is from the 1700s. Agostino Brunellus, sorry to anyone who's Italian, because I've said that really wrong, but he was a painter, and he lived and worked in the Caribbean. And this is his painting called Dancing Scene in the West Indies. So I'm just going to do a time check because, okay. So does anybody want to tell me what they see? So we know one of the ways that I talk about in other trainings about how we can talk about art with students is just to say quite simply, what do you see? I don't know if anybody feels like unmuting and just saying what they see. So we can see people dancing. We can see that the people are people of colour. What do you notice about the women in the middle? So, for example, the woman in the middle, this woman, she's fairer skinned than the other women. So what this is speaking to is the fact that even amongst Black West Indians, there's still some kind of caste division. So people who at that time they were called mulatto, mixed race, were considered, were even within Black communities, were revered more than if you had darker skin. Obviously, same in India with the caste system, if you had very dark skin, it was because you were outside working the fields. And obviously, the wealthier you are, the less likely you were to be out in the sun. And that, sadly, that kind of approach and attitude is still quite prevalent in places like India. But Agostino was quite controversial because at the time, some people said that his work was unnecessarily celebratory of the slaves, because it was a bit like, well, who wants to see the slaves dancing and celebrating? But also, the kind of flip side of that is that actually were the slaves celebrating and dancing, or was this in fact a romanticized view of how the slaves were spending their time? So things like this open for discussion, open discussions up. We can talk about the lives of the slaves. We can talk about the Western perception of the lives of the slaves. We can talk about the fact that an artist called to paint a scene will often fulfill the requirements of the person who has commissioned them to paint the scene. So, for example, the romanticized view of the slave experience in the West Indies. Okay. Lorraine O'Grady, Art Is. This is, again, like I said, showing pictures of the artist, always great. She's still alive now, I think. But this photograph is from a series of photographs that I want to show you. And this series, so that's on the Tate website there, painting we just looked at. This series, Art Is ... So what Lorraine O'Grady did is she had a float that had a giant gold gilded frame, and she had actresses and performers on this float, and they would hop on and off, and they would put these small frames around people, and they were obviously inviting people to answer the question, what is art? Because they were challenging ideals of what art was being portrayed as, and saying, well, actually, who decides what is art? Who decides what is aesthetically pleasing? And the result, the actual body of work, is this series of photographs. Often they feature police officers, kind of alongside the pictures. But questions like what is art and who decides what is art are really good to put to your students. They'll come up with really interesting answers. And again, I would encourage them to think and to consider, who tells you what makes good art? How do you, is the only good art proper art in museums and galleries? And if you think yes, why do you think that is? Because who decides what ends up in museums and galleries? So these are all really important questions to ask ourselves and the students. And you can definitely have those kinds of conversations, even with year one students. In fact, they will surprise you. If you ask a year one student, how do you know when something's a good piece of art? You're going to get such interesting answers. That's my favourite one of the series, I think. So yeah, so that's Lorraine O'Grady. So the artworks I'm showing you now are about stimulating discussion, not just replacing art. And then the next fabulous artist I want to introduce you to, or highlight to you if you've heard of her already, is the fabulous Faith Ringgold. Again, she is still alive and she is such a joy. If you feel like it, just Google her and watch some videos of her. She's so fabulous. And she's primarily, well, not primarily, but she's produced a large body of work that is textile based. And what she is as well is a fantastic storyteller. So her quilts tell stories. There was an exhibition of hers at Serpentine not too long ago. It must have been pre-pandemic, but huge textile pieces, quilts with stories in them. And this is part of a series by her about a family who live in Paris. And one of the things I love about this is that she often does this, it features some of those great master paintings in the background, and she's kind of subverting ideas by having this family dancing in the Louvre, which of course we know that lots of gallery spaces can feel quite fusty and feel like, oh, you must kind of walk around silently and don't move like that and don't go too near the work. So she's really challenging the space of an art gallery and what we do there. So again, important discussions to have with our students. How do we behave around art? Who goes to art galleries? Why do some people go and some people not go to art galleries? But yeah, I strongly recommend looking at Faith Ringgold's work. Her website. Right. It's freezing, so I have to keep coming off that. Just bear with me. She also has a book called Tar Beach, I think it's called, where she, it's actually a storybook, I think most suitable probably for Key Stage 1. So that's worth looking at. But this is her website. She also has paintings. Quite interesting, sort of almost macabre looking figures in some of her paintings. But yeah, the textile pieces are just gorgeous. And again, it's that thing that we spoke about earlier about not just looking at oil paintings, but also recognizing that artists may choose different mediums to work in. That's Faith Ringgold. And then finally on this little section, I just want to highlight to you, you've probably, if you all engage with NSEAD, you probably have heard of or seen the checklists. So again, there's a link to these. These were developed as part of the anti-racist art education group, which I'm a member of, to do with the NSEAD. And we met as a group over, I think, a period of probably longer than a year to develop this really, really concise, really powerful checklist for our educators to use when looking at their curriculum. So it's just about building that reflective practice in, and there's a link for that that you will get as well. really, really interesting questions. I think really useful, not just for art, actually probably useful for other subjects. So it talks about unconscious bias, it talks about intersectionality, colonial legacy, context and terminology, diversity and belonging, cultural capital, and criticality. So it's a really amazing document that has been worked on by a lot of people for a long time. Okay, we're going to have a mini break now, or let's say we'll come back just before 3 o'clock, because we're finishing at 3:30 and I have got quite a few other bits that I want us to get through. So we'll come back just before 3 o'clock, so we're ready to start on 3. So that's a 10-minute comfort break, and I'll see you back then. Lucy, Katie and Laura, if you're back, will you just flash your videos on just so I know you're back? Otherwise, I'm end up waiting for you. Katie's back. Lucy, Laura, are you there? Okay, I'm going to crack on because we've got quite a bit to get through. So the next thing I wanted us to think about was cultural capital. So as of 2019, cultural capital made an appearance in government kind of documents and information sent out to schools. And this was a part of that document. As part of making the judgment about quality of education, inspectors will consider the extent to which schools are equipping pupils with knowledge and cultural capital they need to succeed in life. Cultural capital is the essential knowledge that pupils need to be educated citizens, introducing them to the best that has been thought and said, and helping to engender an appreciation of human creativity and achievement. Now, of course, that's all good and well. So this idea of cultural capital stems from a French philosopher in the 1970s, Pierre Bourdieu, and he made some observations that in terms of social mobility, for example, if you were access or privy to certain sets of cultural norms, cultural enrichment in your childhood, that this would then open doors for you in your future kind of life as an adult and how you would engage with kind of society. So obviously things like being in a household where there are books to be read, possibly being taken to like the ballet, the theatre, those very kind of those forms of culture that are accepted amongst society as high culture. So in terms of art and how that looks in our art provisions, that might look like making sure that students have access to a range of art and artists through curriculum provision. It might also look like planning school visits and trips, and obviously during COVID that was more difficult, but actually one of the good things to come out of COVID lockdown is that lots of gallery websites really up their game in terms of virtual guides. So even showing students, one of my favorite things to do at one point during lockdown was to look at Frida Kahlo's house in Mexico. There's an amazing virtual tour of that you can do. If you're a fan, I strongly recommend it. But those are some of the ways that we can interpret cultural capital for art education. It means engaging with forms of art that are socially, we agree are high art. So things like going to the National Gallery, going to Tate, etc. So at some point, I started to really feel uncomfortable with this as a concept. And I have spoken in a few different forums and led a few different trainings around what I call reclaiming cultural capital. Because if we assume that the students are there as kind of these empty, these culturally void little vessels that need filling up with the correct types of culture, we're making a lot of problematic assumptions about their cultural heritage, about their family kind of background and setup, and it just started to feel really uncomfortable for me. I remember at some point during one of the lockdowns, the place where I was living at the time, there was a lady who lived nearby, and I could hear her constantly. It was the sunny lockdown, actually, it was the first one. And she was always talking with her 2 children, primary school age children. I could hear her cooking with them, she was planting with them, doing all these amazing things. She was Lithuanian, and they would flip between speaking Lithuanian, Albanian, where their dad was from, and English. And she said to me at some point, she said, I don't know what to teach them. I have got nothing to teach them. I can't do the maths and the English. And I just said to her, are you kidding me? I hear you every day. And they were also up every morning doing their kind of, what was his name? Joe, what's his name? Jumping around, exercising thing. But she was so engaged. And yeah, Joe Wicks, yeah. She was so engaged. She was doing so much with them. But she had this real kind of like lack of confidence and this over-reliance on the education system to teach her children everything. And of course, maybe when it came to literacy or numeracy, yes, but there's lots of cultural capital to be had coming the other way. So this is one of my big things, is how we can reclaim cultural capital in our classroom, so that it doesn't just mean feeding the students cultural capital, it means that we celebrate their own cultural capital and they bring that back into the school community, which is how we start to foster genuine appreciation for the diversity within our school communities, not from the display board that says hello in 12 different languages, but through celebrating our students as individuals and celebrating all that they come with in terms of their cultural heritage. So reclaiming cultural heritage. I'm going to give you some examples now of how we can build these kinds of projects in. So a project I worked on with the Tate, which isn't widely available yet, but I'm going to just give you some insight into it and talk to you a bit about it. It's called Hear My Story. Some of you may have engaged with it. It was released over lockdown and it will probably be repackaged and re-released again. But it was all about students sharing with Tate their cultural capital, what made them them. Okay, so it wasn't about Tate going, here's some art you can do, and here's some art by these artists you should know about. It was about us saying to students, you are cultural creators and contributors too, and we want to hear from you. We want to hear your story. So one of the big things that we invited students to do was to research themselves, and also simultaneously, a bit before working on this, which is one of the reasons why I was asked to work on this project, I was doing home learning videos, and I think home learning video number 7, you know, I'd done the kind of still life drawing, draw some scenes from out your window at home, lockdown, and then I got to a point where I said, you know what, I'm going to release a video which is called Be a Homeschool Rebel. And in that video, I invited students to talk to their parents about where their parents had grown up, the languages their parents had grown up speaking, to look at maps, to look at old family photographs, to research themselves. Because actually, and even in my own experience as a second generation immigrant, compared to some of my friends, especially those who come from maybe middle to upper class families, there's a very strong story of ancestors. Often, you know, some of my friends know about their ancestors going back generations and generations. They have heirlooms in the house. They have that strong story of who they are. And actually what happens when you get displaced people, which is often what immigrants are, whether they move for better opportunity, whether they are forced to move because of war or all sorts of other tragedies, personal or global or countrywide tragedies, you get a loss of story about who you are. And as an individual and as a person, if you're then engaging with a culture that's telling you this is the correct culture, it can be quite displacing. So this kind of pushes back against that. This is about the students understanding who they are. And even just thinking about yourself as an individual, think about how much you know in terms of your ancestral lineage, your cultural heritage. How nice would it be for most of us, you know, obviously notwithstanding trauma and things like that, to go back and look at those things, to have time to sit with our parents and grandparents again, to look at old photographs, to look at maps, to go, we move from there to there. And one thing to flag here is that often if you work in a school where you have a lot of white British students, they'll say things like, but I'm just white, I haven't got any. But we all have heritage, don't we? We all have stories. You know, this is really about storytelling. It's really about telling the story of who you are. Maybe you've moved house, maybe your family have lived in that same street for generations. Those are all stories to tell. So one of the first things we can do is invite students to research themselves, and you can do that however structured or unstructured you need to for your school community. But basically it's an invitation to go home and have conversations with the adults around you. And obviously if you've got children in care and things like that, you're going to have to kind of safeguard that and maybe encourage those students to look at local community or local area or school community. So I'm going to introduce, these are some of the artists that we introduced people to in that project. Just some gorgeous artists that we introduced people to. So this is a quote from Joy Labino, and she says, "I always thought that paintings had to be something kind of big and significant, like a specific moment about something or about something spectacular. And then I discovered the Black British artists that were around in the 80s, and they were just making work about everyday scenes, growing up in their family homes. And I looked at their work and I felt warmth because this was something that was familiar to me." So thinking about the fact that we, you know, making art about ourselves is quite validating. So we'll just watch a little bit of a clip of Joy.
Can like a specific moment or their work and like felt warmth because this was something that was familiar to me. They were making spectacular paintings about very mundane, everyday things, and that gave me the permission I needed to like look into myself and figure out how I can kind of make this about me also, not just paintings. So they were a great starting point. I don't necessarily think that I paint like any of these artists, Sonia Boyce, Claudette Johnson, Labena, but in terms of context and subject matter.
That's really important. The artist that I'm showing you here, it's not to say that the students have to produce work that looks like them. What we're embodying and hopefully being inspired by is the concept of using yourself in a celebratory way or an explorative way and producing work that is about that.
They were quite significant for me. I'm British Nigerian, like born in England, but with Nigerian heritage. I was born in Dagenham, which is like London, Essex, on the border. Lived there for about 10 years, then moved to Stevenage, then left Stevenage when I was 18 to go to university in Newcastle, where I was for 5 years, and then I'm in London again.
So the other interesting thing to note about the artists that I'll show you now is that none of them are saying, I'm just this. And I think in our response to the killing of George Floyd and in our rush to be anti-racist and inclusive, what we've kind of sometimes fallen into the trap of going is, oh, this is a black artist, this is a brown artist. And actually, we know that we're all far more nuanced than that, aren't we? We're all, you know, we might have, for example, my family are from Guyana, but obviously in our ancestral lineage, we have Indian. I'm very much a Londoner. So we're all of us made up of these different cultural influences and identities. And that's really important to celebrate, because otherwise we're in danger of asking young people to identify as one thing, one race, one cultural background. And these artists all celebrate the fact that they are of mixed cultural background. So I won't show you that whole video, but you have it in the link. The next artist I want to tell you about is Njideka Kanuli-Crosby. Her work is beautiful, so lovely. She does these kind of like photo montages with loads of patterns, and often you can't see, but in the carpet here are lots of old photographs. So again, she talks about her about her Nigerian heritage, about moving to America, and about marrying a white man, and how that appears a lot in her work.
I'm from Nigeria, which is a hybrid country. We used to be a British colony, and even though we're no longer a colony, there's still evidence of the British presence in our culture. I moved to America in 1999, and even though I've been here since then, home is still Nigeria. My husband is a Caucasian American from Texas, and a huge fraction of my work features my husband, because the overarching theme in the work is this point of union between two cultures.
Okay, so you have that link. Just quickly, she has a lovely website with lots of examples of her work. And then the next artist I want to show you is Chila Kumari Berman. I'm smiling because she's quite a character. And she did, I don't know if you would have seen, but during one of the lockdowns, one of the dark, wintry lockdowns, she did the whole kind of front of the Tate Britain with like neon lights and a big kind of like Indian tiger and an ice cream truck, because her dad, when they first came to this country, had an ice cream van, and so she's really, really cool as well. And there's a lovely video of her. She does a lot of stuff about being Punjabi at Liverpudlian, the ice cream van. She uses the ice cream motif a lot in her work. And she obviously uses her cultural heritage and her mixed cultural heritage a lot in her stuff as well. So Chila Kumari, that's not playing for me. The next artist is Sarah Kwan. Sarah Kwan is, let's see if I can get this one today. No. So Sarah Kwan is more of an illustrator, and her work features combination of Chinese and Scottish cultural heritage.
I'm really Scottish, but I'm also really Chinese. That often appears in my work. My favourite thing about Scotland is the humour. The best part of Chinese culture is the food.
So that video's in the links that you'll get as well, but just quickly, she has this series called East Meets West, where she does these really cool things, mainly through the lens of food. So she's got the Chinese kind of steaming basket with Tunnock's tea cakes in them. Just really cool, really accessible. So those are some nice artists to look at in terms of artists who use their cultural heritage or mixed cultural heritage as inspiration. So in terms of activities, some of the activities that we used in that tape project and that might be useful for you is things like making a museum of you. So remembering that artwork doesn't always have to be drawing, painting, printing, collage, sculpting. Sometimes it's using objects. In fact, a lot of contemporary artists do use objects. And Atul Dodia is an Indian artist who often makes collections of things. So especially during lockdown, this is relevant because the students are at home a lot and they could create a little space where they had a collection of objects, but there's no reason why you couldn't invite students to bring in an object that means something to them and have a class museum or a class display of objects. So these are just different ways that students can celebrate themselves that aren't just self-portraiture, drawing a self-portrait. Victoria Ryan, she makes sculptures that use items from her Afro-Caribbean heritage, avocado stones, mango seeds, and she draws and paints them, but sometimes she'll do things with them as well, actually combine the objects together. And then Zarina Bimji, this is a lovely video which we'll have a link to as well. Zarina Bimji does this really cute thing where she talks about her shoes and the journey her shoes have been on. And so I've done this with year 1 and year 2, where I've had them take off one shoe and put it on the table and interview their shoe. Where have you been? What have you seen? Who made you? Why are you here? Where would you like to go? So it's these ways of kind of celebrating personal objects and also taking everyday things and making them into art, everyday experiences, everyday items, and seeing how they can become pieces of art.
I'm Zarina.
And then outcomes, you know, in the classroom, obviously, they may be different. And really, this kind of approach, this kind of scheme of work is not necessarily about teaching a drawing skill or a painting skill. And when I do training around how to plan and teach art curriculum, I recommend that we have at least one scheme of work per key stage that is this kind of more open-ended, expressing yourself scheme of work. But we wouldn't want to have every single scheme of work like this, because we also do need to teach some skills, don't we? But I think having these opportunities dotted throughout a child's experience in school can be really, really powerful. And then finally, I just wanted to show you this piece of work, which was a sound piece. So just again, keeping in mind that art forms don't have to be drawing, painting. So these were part of the another section of the Hear My Story project, where we recorded stories of young people. So even recording your class talking about themselves or telling stories about their summer holidays or anything like that can be really powerful. So I'll just play you a little bit.
2020 has taught me about self-respect and being grateful for my health and my surroundings. And my family has been a key role in me because they've guided me through hard and happy times. They've also helped me with school, and they've taught me how to cook. They've taught me how to clean and stuff like that.
During lockdown, my lovely cat Leo, he spent lots of time with me and cheered me up. From lockdown, we have lovely memories together that make me laugh, like knocking the plant over. At home, I love cuddling Leo, and he brought a lot of positivity into my life. And without him, my life would be a lot more boring.
At home, I have toys in my box, and then upstairs there's a cat in my bedroom. There's a game on there.
I was home where I was sad because I couldn't do anything. And I got bored. I feel like sleeping all day. And I couldn't go anywhere. I hope next year, but we won't be at home.
I had to stay in my bedroom playing with my toys sometimes. When my mom calls me, then I come downstairs too.
So yeah, those are, sorry, I didn't mean to depress you there. They're really powerful pieces. And actually, when you start to work in this way, you see how when we work in this way with the students, they are really being real artists. They're producing real pieces of artwork. It's not just school art. It's not just a school art project. These are really powerful pieces of art, and they speak to us about the stories and the lives of the young people we teach. I would say that but also obviously I would, if you're going to do a kind of more open scheme of work like this, just touch base with your child protection officer, just so they're aware, because sometimes things can come up in these more open-ended schemes of work. So it'd be good just to flag that with them. Okay. If you want to stay in touch with me, these are some ways you can. My email address is Emily@the Primary Art Class. I have a Facebook page and Instagram page that I use a lot, but also on my website there are lots and lots of resources and various things that I put out to help you with your leadership. So that was a really, really whistle-stop tour of things that we can do to kind of address the points that we started with. So things like replacing or adding art and artists to our current provision, things like contextualizing the art and artists that we look at so that we don't bypass certain cultures or people, things like producing a planning document that keeps us accountable by perhaps having thumbnails of the artists that we look at, things like broadening out to include other art forms so that we're not limited to oil paint and bronze statues, for example. Perhaps we want to introduce ways that we can look critically at the presence of global majority people in existing art rather than just replacing, using the anti-racism checklist, perhaps thinking about cultural capital in terms of reclaiming cultural capital in a way that students can bring in their own experiences, lived experiences and cultural heritage in to celebrate with you and your school community. Okay, so that's all for today. There's quite a lot there for you to take on. I'm just going to have a look. Recipe illustrations from around the world. Oh, that sounds interesting. Okay, so we've got a few minutes now so that if anybody has any questions, and bear in mind that even if you think your question is silly or not relevant, somebody else might benefit from you asking it. So please do feel free to unmute, and this is your time. We're a small group, so ask any questions or make any comments that you might feel like making.
I just wanted to say thank you, Emily. That was so useful, and so it was so lovely to have so much stuff that real practical stuff that I've just got so many notes here. Right, as soon as I hang up today, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. So it's really amazing when you have training like that, where you come away with something really concrete. So thank you. That's all I wanted to say.
You're welcome. And it's sometimes, we're talking about really big, important things, aren't we? But it's always really important to me. I'm not doing a TED talk. It's about you as teachers going back into schools and having stuff that you can do. What's the point? So that's really nice feedback. Thank you.
Totally agree. Totally agree.
Good. Lucy, I think you sent me a message, didn't you? So I've just given you my email.
Got it written down on my 7 pages of notes. Thank you very much.
So those of you who were quite sort of like excited by the Padlet, I will say before you ask for help with Padlet, either from me or anyone else, it's a bit like learning Photoshop or learning how to edit movies in iMovie. The first thing, definitely register for yourself. Give yourself about an hour to play around with it, because it's just one of those things, especially as you're probably quite visual learners as well. It's one of those things where the best thing for you to do is just to play around and practice first. And then if you have any other further questions about it, feel free to get in touch.
Sorry, so can I just clarify, is that like a web page that you create and then you invite other people to it?
It's sort of like a web page. It's more, if you imagine it's a virtual pin board that other people, you can close contributions, so you can have it just for you, or you can have it open to collaboration. But like I said, if you have a look, there are different, they call them, I think, dashboards. I can't remember. Can you remember, Diane? Dashboards.
Yeah, different dashboards. It's like a project board, isn't it? And you can kind of change it to be a different style of what you find suitable. So you all should have had a link to access all the Twilight sessions that have happened so far as part of the conference pass, and that's also a Padlet, but just kind of a different style to Emily's. So yeah, there's lots of different kind of variations and ways you can set them up, and yeah, they're really good. It's like a central space, really.
Yeah.
So step one would be go to Google and just Google Padlet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you might find them useful for also, I sometimes do like mood boards for stuff, or like it's a bit like Pinterest but better. So yeah, I recommend getting on board with that. But yeah, apart from that, we are done. So thank you for being here. Feel free, I love seeing things that people have done. So if you've had success, as well as asking me questions, which is fine, I like seeing the things that you've done. So feel free to send me screenshots or pictures of outcomes and things like that that have been influenced by our time together. Have a fantastic summer holiday. On my Instagram, I just did a post about really prioritizing peace, relaxation, all those good things for yourselves over the summer. So I hope when you get there, you find a way to do that.
Lovely. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks very much. Thank you. It's been really helpful. Really good.
Thank you so much. It's been so helpful.
Welcome. I'm glad.